Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today another exciting deck profile for the premium format. This time talking about one of my favorite clans in the entire game, Aqua Force. And so I've been trying to make a good deck list for Aqua Force, specifically for Thavas in the premium format for quite a while now, and I've changed so many things about the deck, but I think I finally landed on something I'm pretty proud of, pretty happy with. I managed to take it to 2 locals and it performed very well on both of those occasions, so I feel like I'm finally confident enough to talk about this deck and show you what it's capable of. There's one big flaw though with Aqua Force, and that's it's not an unfair deck, it's a pretty fair deck. So if you build something like this, don't expect to go winning big tournaments with it. It's one of those decks that it's good to play at locals level. You might have fun at it against bigger decks because it has a good matchup into Gridora, but against something like Narukami you're just gonna suffer and it's not gonna be fun to play a deck like this. So only build this if you're a big fan of Aqua Force. Don't expect to be like the best deck in the format, because that could come in the future, I guess, because it's a super aggro deck and so it has the tools to just win against any matchup if it just goes first and it aggros well enough. But like, it's more so a fun deck than a super meta contender. So I ordered all of my Thavas and Lambros to show off that I really blinged out this deck because it's one of my favorite units. So let's just immediately get started. We run a V starter because we get a draw and a quick shield, which helps us a lot in just guarding the early damage because we don't need all that much CP in our early game. We also have access to counter charge later in the game, so it helps us keep at low damage so we can see defensives. So that's why I think the quick shield is still really important in this deck. We'll then go over the grade 3s, and I already put a couple down, but I'll get the other ones because I do run quite a big selection of grade 3s. Alright, so maybe we'll talk about these guys first. So these are just 3 of the same card. It's the original trial deck, Thavas from G era. We run it because we have access to the history collection strides. And so because of the history collection strides, we do want to write this one first, get our double XL marker, go into the unhit stride and try to pressure a lot from that point. We do also run 1 copy of V Thavas, which is there because if we get into a matchup where we face against something like Link Joker, who can use Chaos Breaker to give us a force marker and does not allow us to access the history collection strides and get the XL markers from there, we can always just get an XL marker by just riding into him and getting it that way. I then also run a copy of V Lambros, specifically because we run the V Thavas, we can go into V Lambros if we're going first, which also already gives us 2 force markers. So that's a pretty good alternative to being able to stride. But other than that, it also allows us to stride deny. So if we know our opponent does not run a history collection stride and does not have access to a G era boss unit, we can always just use this effect to write down. So the cool thing about Lambros is that he has a built-in skill that says Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, choose a column, stand all the rearguards in that column, and if your opponent's grade 3 or greater, they get +5. That part is less important in this case, but you're able to Soul Blast out your Thavas. Because of Thavas' effect to ride into Lambros, at the end of that turn he will retire the Lambros, and because you don't have a grade 3, you'll be forced to ride back down to grade 2, which means your opponent cannot stride. So that in and of itself is a pretty cool combo, but you don't really get to use it all that often anymore because history collection strides exist. But it's just in here in case you need it. And there's a second reason we do run the Lambros, is because we have access to Forbadal now. And Forbadal is, I think, the reason we can afford to run such a wide selection of grade 3s. I used to actually run even more grade 3s, but I decided to cut them down to the most essential ones. Although there's still a couple that I'm considering changing when I go forward with this deck, because I still feel like they're good, but they're very situational, and maybe I just have to streamline it even more and get to even more of the pieces that will literally just win me the game. So Forbidal, for those who don't know, is a very strong card. So what it says is search your deck or drop for up to 2 grade 2 or 4 units with different card names. All the revealed grade 3s are called to rearguard, and all the revealed grade 4s go back to your hand. So the cool thing with this is we can add the Lambros to our hand, so I have access to it to ride it next turn, or even just use it as stride fodder when we are on our grade 3s, because for the history collection strides, we do need to actually discard a card with grade 3 or greater. or the sum of cards becoming grade 3 or greater. So in that case, we do really just need 8 cards to throw away, which this Lambros can always just be because of the Forbital. But if you needed to rewrite against a deck like Ghidorah, having this resolve, getting this back to hand, you're just able to perfectly write the next turn and have your entire field stand and not be stunned by everything because of his other skill, obviously. When he's placed, you choose any number of your rear guards and you stand them. So normally it's only during the battle phase, but if you were to ride him, it also happens during the ride phase, which is why it counters Ghidorah so well. So I still really like it, and because we have access to Forbital, this is a really nice combo. Something that really works well with that is the new card we got from Standard, which is Sea Strike Dragon on Large Golf. I managed to get a couple FRs, and they're really hard to read because of the gold foiling, but I'll give you a small summary of what this card does. So the first effect is when this card is discarded from your hand while riding a grade 3 from the right deck, or paying the cost for a stride, draw a card. So if you get this thing in hand, you can always pitch it for your stride, not the history collection stride, but the regular stride, and that's one way you can actually get extra draws, and having this in drop isn't that bad because there's a way to get this back. Then its other ability is when it's placed and you have a grade 4 Vanguard or a grade 4 in hand, you can pay a Soul Blast, choose a grade 2 or greater from drop with a different card name, and add it back to your hand. So the cool thing about this is when we resolve Forbital, we'll call this from deck, we'll add this to hand, and even if we haven't strode yet, we can activate its skill, reveal the grade 4 we have, Soul Blast, and add a card back to hand. So even if you don't have another grade 3, which you'll likely have a heal trigger and drop at that point, so that will be your main target, but you could actually just add the Forbital back, ditch the Forbital for stride, and you're golden that way. So these 3 cards, they really synergize, and that's why I think running the Thavas engine to be able to stride deny and play well into Ghidorah is really cool. Other than that, we have 2 restanders, and they both have very different functions. So the first restander is the Water General of Wave-like Spirals, Benedict. He's actually just a grade 3 version of Tidal Assault. For those who know that card, he says at the end of the battle that he attacked the Vanguard. If you have an Aqua Force Vanguard, stand this unit, and he gets minus 5k, and this ability cannot be used for the rest of the turn. So that's the old way of saying it's a once per turn effect. The nice thing about this is he's 10k base, he can be called with Forbital, so he's an easy to access multi-attacker, and if we were to put him on an Excel circle, he'd actually become 15 and 10. And because of the on-hit strides, being able to stride while your opponent's still on grade 2, your opponent's gonna be at 10k base. So the combination of these 2 cards means you just have access to a multi-attacker that gets you to the 3rd wave, which is something we'll talk about later, because you need 3rd wave for your Vanguard skill, without actually using any CB at all. So he's actually one of the easiest multi-attackers, but he's only good, I'd say, on that first one-hit stride turn. He's also usable, I suppose, on your finisher turn with Alexandros, where he can just be pumped with a lot of power and then restand without using CB. But generally we want to go into another restander for that. But still, he's a pretty cool card, and since you're able to fetch him out of the deck with Forbital, he's pretty reliable to use as well. Then the final grade 3 I wanted to talk about, it's Supreme Ruler of Storm, Thavas. So he's the 2nd G era version of Thavas, and he has actually 2 interesting effects, although both effects are a bit mediocre. The reason I do still run him is also because he's callable with Forbital, which Forbital is such an amazing card for anyone that's wondering. If you have this card, just test it out in every premium deck. This is something that just gives you so much flexibility and room. But well, the reason we run this one is because it's a Thavas unit, which means we can search it with some other cards in our deck. He has 2 skills. While on rearguard, if you're in GB2, and we have access to GB2 when we're on the on-hit stride because they already flip one, so it's immediately active. If it's the 1st or 4th battle of the turn, at the end of the battle he attacked, you can counterblast 1, and if you do, stand him. So just like Benedict, he's a restander, but this one does not lose power, but instead just uses counterblast. It's a bit more expensive, but the fact that it works on the 4th wave synergizes really well with the on-hit stride, because the on-hit stride will attack on 3rd wave, which means you can throw all your triggers on this card, and he'll swing twice with the trigger pressure. So he's really cool for that. And then his stride skill, So when a G unit strides on top of him, you can call a card up to 1 card from your hand and choose one of your rear guards and it gets resist. And if that unit has the wave ability, it also gets the ability to attack from the back row. Sadly, I don't run any cards with the wave ability except for him, so that second skill is not that relevant. But obviously the first part, where it gives resist to one of your units, is really cool. So this allows us to call something like Benedict, for example, give it resist, and that way it cannot be out in the Narukami matchup, which is one of the hardest matchups this deck has to face. And so it does have its room, it does have its function, but it's really hard to get this card used effectively. So he's still in here because he's a restander, otherwise he would have been cut immediately. But these are the two, I'd say, flex slots where we can totally look for different tools. I've even considered running this card at more copies because of the amount of plussing it has given me. It also just works perfectly on the gamble turn, which is something we'll go into later. But this is the grade 3 lineup I feel is the most condensed for right now, where it can really just function in so many different situations and still be consistent. And that's all thanks to Forbidal. And so we didn't really talk about G Thavas, and so I'll go into his 2 skills because they're actually quite interesting. So the first one, the stride skill, which all the G era units had a stride skill. When a G unit strides during your turn, you can choose one of your vanguards and it gets the skill. If one of your unit attacks a vanguard, if it's the 4th battle of the turn, choose 3 of your opponent's units and your opponent chooses one of them and retires them. And I gotta say, I always forget to resolve this skill because it's not all that impactful, but it could like change the game in the long run. So it's something you really have to think about, that you have the ability to retire things with your main vanguard, and whatever you stride on top of him will always gain that skill. So it's always an extra retire, which is really good. But it's not all that impactful, and you don't generally play around with the idea that, oh, I will be retiring something on that 3rd wave, on that 4th wave, because your opponent is the one that's gonna choose anyway. And then the GB2 skill on this card is also really good. So that's when you can't stride or when you're out of stride foders. When this unit attacks a vanguard, if it's the 4th battle of the turn or more, until the end of battle, this unit gets a crit, and your opponent cannot call grade 0s from hand to Guardian Circle. So he'll be 11k only, which is a bit low, but because of this skill where he gets the crit and your opponent cannot guard with grade 0s, he actually gets around the sentinels people run in most of the decks. And that's quite interesting because in the past it would be grade 1s that were good to counter because that would be sentinels. But these days, actually being able to tell your opponent he can't call grade 0s is a lot stronger, unless they call grade 3 heals or G guards from the deck, but like that's quite specific. And so his skill to be able to guard restrict is still quite strong. Sadly, we don't have a good way to boost his power, and thus the skill pretty much never gets used. If we're capable of striding, we will stride, and generally our hand size is big enough to stride. So that's it for the grade 3s. I think I talked about them long enough. Let's go into the grade 2s. I'll put my trio of Thavases here to the side so they can look over everything while we look at grade 2s. So the grade 2 lineup is quite extensive because we have a lot of grade 2s that are good. So I've got 4 copies of Repress Strike, 1 copy of Tidal Assault, 3 copies of Coral Assault, and 4 copies of Pursuit Assault. I don't think I have to explain Tidal Assault. He is, again, a very free restander, a very good restander, although he is only 9k. If you're playing against an Excel or Protect deck, he will already be good on that first unhit stride turn. If you're playing against the Force deck, he won't hit and you pretty much will not use him. He's only in here at 1 copy because we only really want to see him during a finisher turn on Alexandros, and later on I'll show you I have tools to revive him if we need him. So he's cool to have, but he's no longer the most important multi-attacker in the deck. We then have 4 copies of Repress Strike Dragon, and this card is so good. It's silly that they printed it. Why is it a restanding Vanguard? Why does it search any card from the top 5 of your deck? Well, any grade 2, but like that's most of the important cards you're gonna be searching in the early game. This card is so good that it warps the deck around itself. So that also allows me to run more grade 3s because for his skill, if he's on Vanguard, I'll just go over his skill. So when he attacks while boosted, you counterblast 1, stand him, and this works on both Vanguard Circle or Rearguard Circle. And if it's the 4th battle of the turn, he gets plus 10k. And if he's on Vanguard Circle, you discard a card from your hand. And so this means that you always get your drive checks because he does not lose drives. And so if you open a lot of grade 3s, you can just, on this attack, you do the restand skill, you discard a grade 3, and then he restands, and you get your second drive. And that way you just filter through your hand and get your pieces you need for your big combo turn. And if the plus 10k he gets, it's not that important on your Vanguard swing turn, on the grade 2 turn, but it's really good on your restander turns because it's 4th battle or more, which means that anything beyond the 4th battle, this thing is a 19k by itself. If you see 1 trigger, it's 29, and if you see 2 triggers, it's 39, and that's massive. Your opponent really has a hard time guarding that. And so even if you check something like the over trigger, he still is just a massive restander after the Vanguard swing. And then for everyone that does not know the actual second skill, since we've got promos I think for every clan right now, but I'll go over it right. So in hand, at the beginning of your right phase, if your Vanguard's grade 1 or less, you discard this card, you check the top 5 cards of your deck, and you choose one grade 2 or less, you reveal and add it to your hand. So this allows you to get a lot of consistency, and I added a card in the grade 1 lineup to help with that mitigation where he's your main attacker, he's your main rear guard, he's your main Vanguard, right? But you also just want to ditch him for pieces. So you need a way to recur him to the field or to hand, and one of the good ways we can do that already is with Enlarge Golf, because if we road him and we do the combo where we call this can Soul Blast out the Repress Strike and we get Repress Strike back to hand. But obviously that's a grade 3 play. There's another card I will show when we go over the grade 1 lineup that will also help us get this back. We then have 3 copies of Coral Assault. She is just the best generic grade 2 rearguard we have, I think, in Aqua Force. At the end of the turn she goes back into Soul, so she has a little bit of Mirage, and that already works on your turn 2 if you have Repress Strike, because he can do 2 attacks and then these would also do 1 attack, which leads to 4 attacks, which means they both go back. And then for her second skill, if you have 4 or more other units that are in rest, she gets plus 15. So she can become a 24 by herself, 29 on the XL. That's really big and swings over defensives pretty much always. So that's why she's still in here. She's really good, she's really versatile, and you do really want the power because we don't have a lot of cards in the G-Zone that give us a lot of power. So units that have power on themselves are pretty reliable. And then we have 4 copies of Pursuit Assault, and I talked about having access to the Lambros play, but for that we do also need to be able to rest cards, and Thavas himself rests only 1, so having 4 copies of Pursuit Assault gives us quite a lot of consistency to being able to rest 3 cards on our field and then right into the Lambros, because this also needs to discard, so because of this draw we get it quite easily, quite consistently. If this is out of our deck, obviously we no longer have access to it. But that's not the biggest issue because Pursuit Assault has a second skill. He says that for every additional rearguard circle we have, he gets plus 5k. And so the cool thing is that even if we don't do this entire play, when we go into the on-hit stride, we already get 2 XL circles, which means he's 19 by himself, 24 on the XL, which swings over a defensive again. So because of the second skill, this combination of cards just synergizes so well. It really bridges the gap between the 2 playstyles, it really bridges the gap between both Thavas playstyles, which is really nice, and he's probably one of the best cards we have access to in this deck. There's also just turns where I go into the Gambled Strike, which we will go over later, which calls 2 cards from the top of our deck as rest, and we just don't have a good way to build a good field, where I just use his ability to Soul Blast 1, rest 2 of those rear guards and get a draw. So we got enough rested rear guards for a Vanguard swing. We're capable of triggering her effect to get the 15k immediately, where we don't need to do awkward swings first. And even if I'm planning to overcall units on my fields because they're just too weak or something, I can also just rest them with him, get another draw off it, and then overcall them so they don't feel too bad. There's just one thing I want to mention really quick, because people will know I will be running this. Only, for example, you can totally rest with the effect of Pursuit Assault and then trigger her own effect to bounce her off the field. And then you still got the draw, you got the blanket effect from Homily. So Pursuit Assault, since he's been printed in V-Series about 2 years ago, he's been the main Thavas support card, and he's still just, he carries the entire thing. He's just so good. So that's the Grade 2 lineup. So Repress Strike is your main ride, you always want to go onto him. But if you have to write something else, it's just dependent on what's available. Everything is recursible from the Grade 3 lineup, so there's definitely choices there, but if you have the choice, go for Repress Strike. So then we'll go into the Grade 1 lineup, and we obviously have to run 1 copy of Elementaria Sanctitude. It's just a mandatory card in premium. I did cut it at one point because I did not have room for it and just run the extra draw trigger, and honestly it works. You don't always have access to this anyway, you have to hard draw into it, but Aqua Force does have a lot of draw power, so generally you will have a way to draw into this and be able to use it. So very good card. We then have 4 copies of Baragios. Baragios is our Grade 3 searcher, and I think most people will immediately understand that this card is just here to find our Forbiddle. Sure, we can also just find anything else, but if you find Forbiddle from the top of your deck, you literally just are okay with discarding any of these cards because it will just recur it and you get an extra value from your deck. So you just get so much advantage from finding Forbiddle of the Grade 3 searcher that I bumped the Grade 3 searcher to 4, even though I don't really like the top 5 checks, because generally they whiff, they're not that great, but if you find Forbiddle, you're just so happy. So it's a bit of a high roll card, I suppose, but it adds that little bit of consistency it needs. He's still also a really good rear guard. We then have 2 copies of Kelpie Rider Nikki. Nikki says when he's placed, you can reveal when he's placed from hand, which is pretty important, you can reveal a Grade 3 from your hand and search your deck for up to 1 Thavas Grade 3, add it to your hand, and then choose a card from your hand and discard it. And so that's why I mentioned that we also just run the Restandard Thavas, because he can access any of he can access V Thavas, original G Thavas, and second G Thavas just by being placed. So he gives a little bit of consistency on choosing which play we want to go, and he's generally the target I want to add of my Repress Strike discard. So if I see him in my top checks, I will probably go for him, get him, and then fix my ride that way. So 2 copies of Nikki. It's not always a consistent A2, but it does work, and he also just helps you if you're on your on-hit strike turn to get your V Thavas for the second ride. So during your second strike, you generally just want to rewrite into V Thavas to get an extra XL, and so he helps you get that consistency too. Because he has to be placed from hand, it works with the stride. So that's one of the other ways I do like to use him. Then we have 2 copies of Only and 3 copies of Dianta. I don't think I have to explain Honolly. I wish I could run it more because it's a really good card, but it's also very situational. Decks like Neo Nectar just are not affected. Decks like Neo Nectar are just not affected by it at all, so it doesn't really work in those matchups, and then it becomes my main right target more than anything. It also just helps you damage deny against something like Grand Blue, for example, who wants their CP on the second turn. And so I still like this card, and since it's semi-searchable, I suppose, by the effect of Repress Strike, I feel like it's a good card to have in the deck. It's also recursible with Dianta, which means we can Superior Call it later on in the game if we Soul Blasted it out. There are a couple of things we can do with this, but we can't call it during our opponent's turn. That's the only flaw there is. And there is one play I have against Narukami where this card is really relevant, and I'll try to go over it once we go into the combo segment of the deck. And then the final card, and I feel this is one of the cards that binds the entire deck together as well, which is Performing Battle Dianta. In the past, I've seen people run the Orders that revive cards, but I really dislike Orders. Orders generally clunk up my hand and just don't give me the bodies I need to put out the pressure I really need in the early game. And Dianta, she's just amazing because when she's placed, if my Vanguard is grade 3 or greater for a counterblast, I can revive a grade 3 or less card from drop and call it to rear. So this gives me access to pretty much my entire deck. And that's so good because you can revive the Honley, which would be a way to stop your opponent, but you can also just revive Restanders, revive a card that would plus you, revive your Mirage unit so you get a lot of draw power extra. In the late game, if you don't have a Restander anymore, revive the Tidal Assault, so obviously it does use then 1 CB to restand, but you don't need a CB anymore after that, so it's one way to manage your CB use, or if you have enough CB, you can totally just use your effect, get Repress Strike, and then Repress Strike immediately has a booster. So Dianta is really cool, and she becomes even cooler when you realize that the on-hit stride calls a card from hand during on-hit timing, which means her skill to be placed from hand works, goes off and revives something during the battle phase. And one of the craziest plays I do with this is, if I have something like this on my Excel circle, I overcall it with the skill, and then her skill goes off, we pay the counterblast and call this again, which then soul blasts one and gets us another card to hand. So if my opponent has not seen defensives, this is one crazy way to just get a lot of extra value to your hand and an extra two attacks. So she's really good, and I kind of wish I could run her at 4 too, but space is so tight. I feel like these are the ratios that give me the most consistency to when I need these cards. So that's it for the grade 1 lineup. Then we have one more thing to go over, which is triggers, and I suppose G-Zone, so that's 2 more things. Trigger lineup is very straightforward. We run 4 copies of Petros. Petros is the Thavas crit, so this is the one that's been errated. If it goes to damage, you get a draw, and if your Vanguard with Thavas in the name attacks, you can put him into soul for a draw and plus 5k, which synergizes really well with the way Aqua Force plays, because Ganbolt can call this as stress from the top of your deck and then on attack put them in soul for extra draws. So it has its tools. We then run 1 copy of the direct Brave Strike Shooter. So he is also an extra copy of Petros pretty much. He is also GB locked unlike Petros, but the other skill is the same and gives 10k instead of 5k. So he just functions as an extra copy because 99% of the time we will be just on a Thavas Vanguard anyway. We then run 3 copies of the Stride crits, so these can be discarded for Stride, but not for the on-hit Stride. The reason I do still run these is because I feel like if I'm going to, I generally just want to rewrite again, so I won't always have enough grade 3 copies in my hand to ditch for Stride. So if I see combo lines where I just want to call my grade 3s down, I'm more than happy to just throw away a crit instead. Then we run 4 copies of the Draw PG. Since we run a copy of Elementaria, we can't run any more. We then have 4 grade 3 heals and 1 copy of the OT. Grade 3 heals are the best thing you can run because Enlarged Gulf can just return these to your hand, which is a really easy way to get a lot of value. And then the OT, I don't think I have to talk people into why you run over triggers. Whichever over trigger you prefer honestly works. I've seen people run red OT as well in this deck because it's just an extra extension of your attacks. It would give you 3 attacks instead of 2 attacks, but this one gives crits, this one gives a front as well. It heals, it draws. This card is silly. If you check it on your first Stride turn, you generally just win the game automatically. So that's it for the main deck. Let's see if I can bring up my G-Zone, and for that I will clear off these cards to make it easier, because the G-Zone is quite a lot of cards. I'll go over my G-Guards first. Right. So we run 6 G-Guards in this deck, and they all kind of serve their own purpose. But the reason we can run more G-Guards than I suppose other decks is because Galphilia has the ability to flip herself back face down for a Soul Blast, which means we can always just use the other 4, have those 4 face up, and then we can't G-Guard anymore. But that way we always can use all of our G-Guards during a game if need be. We probably won't, but it's something to consider. Right, let's see. So Calphelia first, she is also your main flip target when you stride because she has the ability in the G zone to Soul Blast 1, turn herself face down, unlock a card on your circle, or counter charge. So the cool thing about this is that she counters Link Joker as well as she helps us maintain our counter blast because we don't really use all that much counter blast, but all of our strides do have an on-attack counter blast cost. Our main restander, being Repress Strike, also uses counter blast, so we do want to have the counter charge. Her guard skill, on the other hand, isn't that great. So she says on the second or third wave, you get plus 5k shield, so the max she can become is 20k shield. So generally, when you G-guard, this won't be enough to stop the attack. You will be using the others to G-guard, but she is the thing you flip with your flip G-guard and with your main strides. We run her at 2 because we can always flip 1 during our own turn with the stride and then flip 1 when we're guarding, so we have 2 face up. We flip both back face down and counter charge 2, so we have enough CB to at least do our Vanguard skill and 1 restander. We then have 1 Blue Storm Deterrence Dragon, Ice Barrier Dragon. The reason I run him is because he's the only one outside of Calphelia that does not use CB, but he does have more shield value, which is really good. So first battle or fourth or more, when this is placed on Guardian Circle, plus 10k shield. So this one is just 25k shield, which is a good number. It's not amazing, but it helps you get there. And since it's free, I can't really complain about it. Then we have the newest G-Guard, the Rebellious Heavenly Flow General Dianera. When she is placed on Guardian Circle, you pay a counterblast to perform the following effect depending on what battle it is. So for the first battle, you choose one of your units and it gets plus 5k until end of turn. And this effect is fine. I've used it a couple of times to just put my Vanguard at 16k. But I don't always feel like that's the most relevant thing to do. Like, it's good if you also see a defensive afterwards, so he becomes 26. Then at that point, generally, you can stop most attacks with 5k shield. But it's clunky. I haven't had that many games where I felt like the plus 5k is the most relevant thing I've done. Like, you're still discarding a G-guard for it, you're still paying the counterblast for it. And so her second effect is more interesting, but it's fourth battle or more, so it's quite late. But at that point she gets plus 20k shield until end of battle. So it no longer gives a blanket effect for plus 5, it's just that she becomes 35k shield. And that effect is already pretty good, because it does not rely on you having rear guards, it just talks about a number of battles. So I still think that that's a really good effect, but I still have to experiment when I really want to use either of those effects. And then the best G-guard we have, the Guard Leader of Sky and Water, Ioannis. So she's GB locked, which generally isn't a problem unless you're going first and you're stuck, you can't stride. Then it does kind of suck, but we can totally just use one of the others then. So when she's placed, you counterblast 1 and you flip a G-Guardian face up, which will be always Calphelia unless you don't have a choice. And then choose up to 5 of your rear guards and they get resist and cannot be hit. And this gets plus 5 for each chosen card. So this thing protects your entire field and tells your opponent, like, you're not clearing my field anymore this turn. And unless they do it during the main phase, which most control decks do, it does help make sure that your intercepts don't get killed off and you have access to them during the next turn. But it also just forces you to have a field for it to be effective. So at most, she can become 40k, which is a really respectable number, but it does require a field, which isn't always reliable. But since she flips, she is also the G-guard I generally go to if I get in a situation where I need to guard for a certain number, because she then flips face down again for the counter charge later on. So it's kind of free, but it takes a turn. So this is the main G-guard, I'd say. You can totally change this last one out for a very specific card I want to mention, which is a Dismal. So she kind of fulfills the same function as with Dismal in giving resist and cannot be hit, whereas Dismal, I believe, is only give resist. Yeah. Oh no, it also just gives both effects. So she's kind of like Dismal in the sense that she gives it to everyone, where Dismal only gives it to one unit. But in the way that I play the deck, I feel like Dismal could really function in the same way. So if you have access to Dismal, definitely try testing with one copy of Dismal in the extra deck, because I feel like you're never gonna do this more than once unless you have the CB for it and a full field. So having a Dismal might just be better, but it's very situational in how it works. But I'll go over why Dismal is good when we get to the combo section of the deck. So this is it for the G guards. And then for our strides, we have also a very cool lineup. We have 2 copies of the on-hit stride, 2 copies of the Blue Storm Steel Dragon, Ganball Dragon. We have 1 Progenitor Dragon, 1 Blue Furiargus Charge Dragon, 2 Alexandros, 1 Messiah, and 1 Valios Revive. So let's get into the on-hit stride first. He is pretty much your go-to stride when you're going first. There's one situation where you probably don't want to do it, it's when you stride deny, but if you can stride into this, it gives you the 2 XLs, which is the most relevant thing it can do. And then on attack, if it's a 3rd battle or more turn, you get that draw and you spear call something. So this allows you to do a very nice multi-attack without actually using CB. So all the CB you have can go to rear guards, which is your main restander, for example, being Repressed Strike. So this card is really good. I would consider running it at 3 copies because it's totally free, does not use CB. So it's also a good stride to go into in the late game. If you flipped your Golfilias face up, you generally always will have 1 CB, so it should not be an issue. But yeah, this card is really good. It kind of just replaces Lambros, which we had in the deck for a very long time. I feel like it's just a better version of that because you don't require anything but 3 attacks, which you will always be able to do because you'll always have 2 front row circles. So this card is really, really good. Then Gambold, which is the staple in Aqua Force since its release. This is the card that allows you to deck yourself out and never die before you do it. When he's placed, you check your top 7, you call 2 cards as rest, which your main targets you're gonna call from this are either your Enlarge Gold, because he will push you and give you pieces to establish a board, or something like the crits that go into Soul, because if they're rested, they're not gonna boost, but they didn't have the power anyway, and they refund themselves as draws later on. So he gives you access to those cards, or just filters your deck out. And then on attack, for every 2 of your rested rear guards, you get a draw, and then you choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it. So for every 2, which means generally you will be having, with 1 XL marker, 6 rested rear guards, which means you draw 3 cards, your opponent retires 3 cards, and then if you drew 3 cards, you can stand 2 of your rear guards. So it's a pretty good skill. It just builds a giant hand. It does not put up all that much pressure. That's the only flaw it has, but can't really complain with how much value it gives you in hand size. This is the stride I generally go into if I go second, because it just makes sure I can survive my opponent's finisher stride turn, because generally people try to finish you on second stride, and this kind of generally allows me to survive that. So that's why he's so good. He's in here at 2 copies because you're in a losing situation. You're probably just always gonna want to go into him, get enough face-up cards in your G-zone to then try and finish on Alexandros later on in the game. We then have 1 copy of the Progenitor Dragon. This was the original win con when we strike tonight, because we would go back into discard a card with the same card name, and then stride him. And his skill is, when your opponent's Guardian is placed, you can create 1 or less from your hand and retire that Guardian. So it changes the game to a game of who has the most cards in hand and who has the most cards it can discard, and that's a really unique way, I suppose, to win the game. It does, however, mean that you need to have more cards in your hand than your opponent, or your opponent just needs to not have enough shield value to survive the barrage of decks you're trying to do. So it's a good card, but it's also, I feel like it's fallen off a bit because we have the on-hit strides now. It used to be really the thing I always went into on my second stride and tried to finish on it, so it's still in here because it's also a really good stride, because the G-zone effect allows you to stride without paying costs, which helps you in the later stages of the game. But yeah, it's still in here. I don't go into it all that often, so if you don't have this card, don't feel bad about it. Just replace it with like an extra copy of Furiargus, for example, because he's definitely just as good. So talking about Furiargus, his effect is really cool. He says at the end of the battle you attack, counterblast 1. You get an imaginary gift XL. and then choose up to the same number of rear guards as the number of face-up cards in your G-zone, stand them, and choose up to one of your rear guards and move it to an additional open rear guard circle, and it gets plus 10 until end of turn. So this guy is my go-to stride when I'm stuck on a wrong ride, and that's something like this Thavas, for example. When I am forced to ride this as my first ride, I generally go into the Ferriargas because I get the extra XL, which helps me into achieving a win con later on in the game. Other than that, this guy is also a finisher because for every face-up card in the G-zone, he stands something. And because we have a lot of rear guards that have good base power, this kind of means that those rear guards swing for good numbers. And then the last part of him, where he chooses a rear guard, moves it to the XL circle and gives it plus 10, works really well with one of our restanders. This one, for example, because it would have been 15 on the XL, becomes 25, and any triggers put it at 35. So you get good numbers out of this. You can totally put it in the back row if you were to have called it with the Storm Thavas and gave it resist, and then move it with this, so it's on that circle with resist. Your opponent can't clear it, and you had a lot of pressure from it. So he's a lot better than people think at first, but he does kind of force your opponent to be at a decent amount of damage already for him to be really effective. So he would definitely be fine at 2 copies because you can totally stride him twice in a game and get value from it. But I feel like right now I'm okay with 1, because generally I just go into him as a potential finisher if I feel like I can just win by overwhelming my opponent with enough attacks instead of needing power to hit over a certain threshold. We then have 2 copies of the Marshal General of Spring Seas, Alexandros. So this used to be the finisher, I believe, for Aqua Force in G era, and he's still definitely worthy of that title. So what he says is, on the 2nd or 3rd battle of the turn, you counterblast 1, flip a card face up in the G-zone. At the end of the battle you attack, you choose 2 of your rear guards, stand them, and they get plus 5 for every face-up card in the G-zone. So if you get to something like 6 cards, that's plus 30k. 30k on your restanders without any triggers is pretty good. So something like these guys, they would become 39, and then because this would happen at 3rd wave, both of these would attack at 4th, which means they would be 49 by themselves. And obviously the first time they have to be boosted, so you get the gist. They become so massive, which is one of the ways you can just close out the game. And that's one of the only cards actually in the deck that allows us to get a lot of power, because the other cards don't actually increase power, where this one does. So I put him at 2, kind of because I'm afraid of Gizeh, because this is the only way we would be able, in theory, to swing over Gizeh. But even then, it's probably not enough to finish. So you can also run just this at 1 copy, but I feel like it's still a good finisher to go into. So you at least 1 should be in your extra deck, I feel. We then also have a copy of the Torrent of Determination, Valios Revive. He's really interesting because he works well against something like Narukami, for example, who will try to clear a field because he just calls a new field mid-battle. So his effect is, when he attacks, counterblast 1, turn a card in your G-zone face up, call up to 2 cards from your hand for each face-up card in the G-zone, draw cards equal to the number of cards called, and if your G-zone has 2 or more face-up cards, choose one of your opponent's vanguards until the end of the turn, increase or decrease its power to 11k, and it cannot increase or decrease other by the effect of Guardians. Other by his effect or Guardians. And so with this effect, you can play around decks that have ways to increase their power. Like Neonectra, for example, has a couple of cards that just say Ines, I believe is her name. Whenever a unit is called, gain power, but they then have a G-guard that calls something during the battle phase, so they gain power on your turn. And this allows you to lock them at 11k, which means you can just punch them with every single card you have. And this also stops your opponent from checking their defensive OT. Well, it does not stop them, they can totally check that defensive OT, but your turn is not over when they check it, because you still have access to all the rest of your attacks, and your opponent's gonna sit there like, oh wait, I haven't won the game yet. So Valios Revive is a really cool card. He does have a pseudo GB3 effect, I'd say, because you need to have 2 or more face-up cards in the G-zone. I suppose it's the GB2 effect more so, because he flips one himself, yeah. So it's a pseudo GB2 effect, but he is still really good, and He works well against decks that can retire your field by just when on attack they put something from a G card on the Guardian Circle, retire your stuff. That's fine because on attack you will be calling a new field and your opponent has to deal with that new field again. So he's really good, but you'll never try him more than once. If you go into him, you hope to finish on that turn. He does draw you cards, which does kind of make so that if you go into him, you have to make sure you don't deck out, because everything you call is going to be a draw, and then you'd still have his triple drive. So it's dangerous, but he has a really cool effect. He counters certain strategies, and that's why he's really good to have at least one copy in here. And then last but not least, we have the Harmonix Messiah, who gives us the Guardian ticket. Honestly, the rest of the effects are not that important. Take your time to read it yourself. I've never thought about trying it, but it's sometimes good to flip them face up, because if your opponent damage denies you, this allows you to get in extra damage, which that extra CB is gonna help you in certain matchups. But yeah, I haven't actually had that come up in any of the games during the locals either. So that's it for the G zone. That's it for the main deck. Let's go into a little segment I like to call things I cut from the deck, but are probably still interesting to look at. So there's 3 ideas I had in mind. Alright, I collected the cards for this segment of the video. So there's 3 combo packages, so to say, I like to go over that are interesting to put into your deck. They do require you to take out some other stuff, but I'll try to tell you what cards you could take out to fit these in. So there's 3 I like to go over, and the first one would be the best one, I'd say, and I'll go down to the more copium ideas, I suppose. And you can figure out yourself if you like these ideas, if you think that's what your deck needs, that your locals needs. But without further ado, let's get into the first one. And so it's the Legion pair. It's the Ripple engine that allows you to Legion and get a really strong effect. So for people who haven't been playing Vanguard that long, Legion is a very old mechanic they actually didn't support all that much. But luckily, due to a V card we received, which is the Thundering Ripple Genovius, we actually have a way to benefit from the old Legion mate, or Legion leader, I suppose, Miltiades, who can Legion with Genovius and put these 2 cards on your Vanguard circle. So Legion specifically returns 4 cards from your drop zone to your deck, and then you search the Legion mate, who is noted on the card within the Legion skill, and then calls out the Legion mate to your Vanguard circle from the deck. So this allows you pretty much to return about 3 triggers to your deck. If you have enough deck size, you can even return your over trigger. You could return 3 heal triggers. There's a couple of things you could do, but generally it's gonna increase your trigger consistency by a lot. And that could just be the one thing you need to finish off the game. Now, Genovius has another big part that makes him good, and I'll go over him first before I actually talk about Miltiades. So even if you don't really do the Legion play, he still has use because he has an Excel marker. And we do have only one Excel right in this deck, which is the V Thavas. And so having an extra copy of something that gives you an Excel means that you have a better chance at going second. His first act skill says Soul Blast 1, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose 1 card from among them and call it to the rearguard circle. So this skill is really good when you're on your Legion, because they'll both be Vanguards, so the skill will be live. And this allows you to build a field and filter your deck when your deck size is really small. So that's a really cool way to just get another body on the field, pretty much revive anything also, because you can just Legion a unit back that you want to revive, and that way you get it on the field and get the value from it. Then a second skill, and the reason why this play is actually interesting, when this card attacks, if you don't have any standing units, Counterblast 1, choose one of your rear guards, stand it. Then, if you have 4 or more damage, so limit break 4, you can stand all of your rear guards instead. If you have the grade 2 Ripple in your soul, everything stood gets plus 5k. We don't run the grade 2, so it's not relevant. I don't think you should be running the grade 2 unless you really just focus on this play, which I don't think most people will be doing. So the plus 5k doesn't matter, but it stands all of your units, which means it's like a full board restand, which makes it very similar to this Stride we have, which is for Yargha's Dragon. And so in power level, they're probably pretty similar, except this gives you an Excel and plus 10k. It has triple drive, this thing does not have triple drive, but you see where it kind of just overlaps in what it does. And that's the reason I did actually decide to cut it, because I feel that the Stride does the same thing pretty much. But the nice thing is, so this one costs a CB, but Miltiades has a skill that allows us to countercharge and potentially draw, but we do have to make sure that we don't deck ourselves out by the draw. So there's a way to play around this. So her skill is, when this attacks, if you're in Legion, if you have 3 or more units that are in rest in your front row, choose up to one of your units, stand it. The nice thing is this says up to one of your units, so you're not forced to stand anything with this skill. Then countercharge, and if there's 3 or more rested units in your back row, draw a card. So the issue being that Genovius asked for every unit to be rested, means that you can't have those 3 units in the back row. So one of the cool things you could do is actually, when you're building your fields, if you have a Honolly, just remove it from the field so you don't have actually 3 units in the back row. And that's one way to open up your back row circle so you don't actually draw from the Miltiades. Then our on-play skill is not that important. It allows you to mill your deck, and that way you could actually get more ripples, but we don't actually run other ripples. So it's a very cool finisher that allows you to reset your deck, and because we actually have strides that do deck us out, like Genovius, we could go into this grind game mode where we just draw a lot of cards, try to get a massive hand to survive, then go into Genovius, call a bunch of units on the field, and swing with, like, I believe it's 12 to 14 attacks if you have enough Excel circles. And so this combination is one of the ways to win in a very long grinding game. Sadly, most of the decks have a alternate win con right now, which means that you don't actually get into the situation where you're so low in deck size that you want to go into the Legion play. Most of the time you would just win by going into any stride, like into Furiagus. But it's a very cool thing to add to your deck, and if you're just playing for fun, definitely test this out, because being able to Legion in 2024 is such a cool feeling. So yeah, this is a small engine you can put. What I would take out to fit this is simply the 2 restanders. So you don't actually need these. They're good with 4 battle, but even then, with 4 battle we already have 2 different targets, so generally we add the Lambros, if I can find a large goal. So generally you're just running these 2 targets for the 4 battle anyway, so I'd say just if you cut these 2, you can fit this in. You don't need these restanders. They also really don't synergize with the way Genovius works, because they would be able to restand on the first, and then I guess this on the second wave, and you'd get 4 attacks out of these, but they don't actually hit all that good numbers. And so if you're gonna restand them, it's never gonna be that 4th battle again, because you'll be doing way more than 4 battles before your Vanguard attacks. So these are the 2 easiest ones to cut to fit these 2 cards in. Right, so that's it for the Ripple engine. I really like it. I think you should test it out to see if you like it. It's an alternate win con, and I feel like it's one of the things Aqua Force can play into, because you're gonna have enough draw power to see this go to your hand, and if this is in your drop, you can perfectly put it back with the Legion skill and then Legion it out. So the second thing we got is the blue wave pieces, and there are also 2 cards you have to fit. Well, have to is maybe a big word. You can just literally play one of each of the, well, just one of them. So either go for the Valios, go for a Tetra Drive, or do 2 of one of them. And they also force you to play a different starter. They actually want you to play the V starter, Blue Wave, which I don't actually have on me right now either. Anyway, so the cool thing about this is if you go into Valios, when he strides into a Blue Wave unit, which is the Flood Hazard, which you will have to put in your extra deck, you can actually lock your opponent's power at 11k. So it's very much like your Valios Revive, where you can lock your opponent's power down, which gives you an alternate way to combat decks that increase their power during guarding. Also, it stops over triggers, so that's really cool. But it has a second part. The fact that the strike you go into is a restanding Vanguard means you actually play around Honolly, because this can be your, if I remember correctly, your 4th and your 5th. Well, no, it restands at the end of the battle that your rear guards with Blue Wave in the name attacked. So we already run 4 copies of Baragio, so this is a Blue Wave unit, which means we'll definitely see one in time for when we want to do the restand play. At the end of the battle it attacked, if it's the 4th battle, you can restand this guy and then he can become your 5th attack. So you actually played around Homily. The other nice thing is he has a GB3 skill, which when we go into our basic on its stride play, we already have 2 face-up cards at the end of that stride. So just striding into him as our second stride gives us that GB3 ability, and which means he gets an extra drive. So he'll be 4 drives, and I believe he loses 2 drives, or 3 drives actually. Yeah, he loses 3 drives, so he's 4 and then 1. So 5 drives total, which is pretty good actually for your hand size. And because he locks everything in power, cards like this actually hit for good numbers as well. So yeah, it's a really cool card. The reason I did decide to cut it is because I haven't had that much problem with Honolly. Like, if people leave it on the field, you just retire it. If they don't leave it on the field, you just have to go a little bit softer, but you can easily do that with a combination of Genbolt and our Grade 2 Pursuit Assault, because these two allow you to get a lot of plussing and stay under those 5 attacks while just doing decent pressure, I suppose. It's not a lot, but it makes sure you can survive definitely until next turn when they don't have Homily anymore. So yeah, this play around Homily, it's cool, it's creative, it does add another flavor to the deck, and I really like Valios. He's one of my favorite units, so I did really try it, but when I bricked and I had to write this guy and then stride into this to even get any value, because if you were to go into Gambolts on him without an Excel circle, you can't do stuff. And I suppose I should have gone into Furiargus, but my hand size was already pretty low, so it didn't really feel like I was getting payoff from this. So yeah, if you have to do it without extra Excel circles, because he doesn't give an Excel, it kind of sucks. And that's where Tetra Drive comes in. His skill is not important at all. Let's be honest, he does not ever want to do any of those skills. I suppose that the restand that gives you -1 drive is fine, but it's more of a downside than an upside. No, he's just a blue wave unit with an Excel marker. So if you run him, you can definitely just run these in the extra deck, have the restanding Vanguard, but just give you an alternate ride for when you don't have your V Thavas to get the extra Excel marker. He's kind of like the Ripple's Grade 3 in the sense that if you have to ride him, he isn't that bad. And so I would even say, like, it's possible to run 2 of these and actually have a really good thing going. But having the power lock, it's also really sexy. So it's something you can figure out maybe for yourself if you want to try to fit this engine. Again, for these, you kind of want to get rid of your restanders and your Grade 3 slots so you can fit these in. So the same cards as last time. So then I have one more thing I want to talk about, and I feel like this is the most copium idea to say so. It's these 3 cards. So the cool thing is that we get quite a lot of Excel markers. So if we have done the on-hit stride, we'll have at least 2 on our field. And then if we rewrite into something like Vitavas, we were to get a 3rd Excel marker. So when we stride into Valios Revive, we actually have quite a lot of circles to fill. We'll have at least these 2 circles and then 3 more Excel circles to fill. And when he attacks, you'd have to commit a lot of cards from your hand. But generally that's pretty hard to do. Now there's one really cool thing you could do is when you attack with him, you flip a card face up in your G-Zone, and that would be your Storm Element Cyclone, which says that all units that don't have abilities get plus 5k. You then get to call cards equal to the face-up cards in your extra deck, which would be 4 cards at that point. So you theoretically could fill up pretty much all of your board. But that's hard because you haven't done drive checks yet. So what you can do is call about 3 cards from your hand, which might be fine. Could also just be 2, and that'd be totally fine because this could still be here from before you attacked. And just call it like this. And when she's placed, she'd call 2 plant tokens to these circles. I don't think I have my plant tokens on me, so I will proxy them just like this for now. And those plant tokens would be 5k base, but because the Storm Element Cyclone, they get plus 5, so they're 10k. And then because of the Excel marker, they'd be 15k. And because of Valios' skill, your opponent's power is locked at 11k, so both of these hit. This one would be 14, so it hits. And then whatever rear guards you have here, well, Tidal Assault is a pretty bad target, but let's say they're just Pursuit Assaults, they also just hit. So this gives you a lot of extra attacks for low commitment from your hand. So it's a really cool way to just punch out a lot of extra attacks, definitely against matchups like Narukami, who are really hard to deal with. There's one flaw though, you have to run this card, Prot Pollen Raphaelus, and she is not that great. So she would take in a slot from another card that you don't want to lose. I suppose the cool thing is that she can also just call boosters, which means that stuff like your restanders are much easier to use, because then they would swing for stuff like 29, because this would get bonus power, and if there's only triggers on there, that's just really big. So it's a small engine you could play where you need a couple of copies of this card, or at least one. But the problem is that she uses up CB, this uses CB, and this uses CB, so it's a very hard thing to fit. But I think it's interesting enough to mention, because it's something I want to experiment with, because it could be good in matchups like Narukami, like Link Joker, for example, where you just have tokens in the front row, so your opponent does not want to lock those. So yeah, I think she's a really interesting card. She works really well with Cyclones and with Fabios Revive, and there might just be something there that's worth exploring. So that's it for the extra engine segment of the deck. So there's one more thing I like to go over, which is a bit of a combo play, which I call my anti-Narukami play, because that's one of the hardest matchups this deck can have. The sad reality is we kind of have to go first and have to go hard if we want to finish it. So we generally always want to be able to go into our main play, which is the title board play, get both Excel circles, and just pressure as much as possible. This leaves us with one flaw though. We now have 4 front row circles, and Narukami has access to a card known as Exterminate Dragon. And Exterminate has this strong effect where they get plus 5k for every open circle. So we have to play it smart and make sure that our field is full. So what I generally want to do is try to keep something like this, and the nice thing is we can kind of fill up our field as we go and still plus quite a lot thanks to the Anta. And then leave this in the back row center, potentially calling it with the Vanguard skill at the end of the battle he attacked. So everything would be flat, just like this. And we destride, and we'd pass our turn on specifically this board. Now there's a reason we put Honolly behind Vanguard. So I think it would be smart if we put a picture up of Sweep Command Dragon right now, because that's their main great rewrite when they're going second. So Sweep Command says that he can bind one of your opponent's front row units, and then choose one of your opponent's units and move it to the front row. Now generally your opponent is going to use its effect to bind one of your cards, and then say, I'm not moving anything because I want to empty your front row. Their second skill will trigger, and they bind a second card. That's generally what they're gonna want to do. But that leaves Honolly in the back row, and so they're not gonna be able to do a lot of attacks. So actually getting a lot of power on their restanders is not useful at all. So instead, they'll be forced to move the Honolly, then remove the Honolly. Then they'll probably have one of the restanders known as Cho-O. They'll use Cho-O's effect to bind another one, and that's probably where they have to leave it, because they won't have the resources to go any further. If they're lucky, they get a third Cho-O, but then they're burned at least 3 CB, and we just have to pray a bit, obviously, that we survive the pressure. But generally, if you're going first, you're not going to have a lot of damage, so a little one defensive should help you survive the entire turn. But this specific setup forced them to actually put a lot more effort into clearing your field. And if, for some reason, they decide to just remove these two, then call the Cho-O, remove another one, they'll be locked, and they won't have any tools to remove this. So if they go Sweep Command Dragon, they have to be smart enough to be targeting the Honolly, otherwise they're kind of stuck in their little 5-attack routine. And so that's a little puzzle you give your Narukami opponent, and if they don't actually approach it in the right way, they're losing out on a lot of value, on a lot of pressure, and you might just be able to clench out the game by restanding, re-riding, doing your stride stuff, and just win the game from there. And the one nice thing there is if you stride into something like Valios Revive, well, we obviously would remove this from the game if they don't kill it. Even if they were to kill some of our stuff on attack, as long as we have pieces on hand to fill out the field again, we can still do a lot of pressure. And it's unlikely that they'll be able to kill that second field off. So one more thing I wanted to mention about the Honolly thing, and I'm putting it in later in the recording because I forgot to talk about it. So there's one big thing though. If your opponent thinks you're going to be smart and they'll go into the Stunverse play, it's still kind of hard for them to get to a good point. So let's say they ride into Vanquisher and stride into Stunverse. then they'll get the ability to counterblast one and bind one of your front row units. But generally, if your opponent's planning to go into the on-hit stride after, they won't do that, because they'll think that with the on-hit stride ability, they'll be able to bind the anomaly anyway, so it's not good enough to use a CB on the removal ability. And so those stun bursts, you get the ability to bind 4 of your rear guards. You'll just go like, yes, take my front row rear guards, I'm totally fine with that. And then they'll destride, they'll go again into their, that time they go into the on-hit stride. They can't actually remove anything, because obviously Vanquisher only targets front row units. Most of Narukami's removal always targets front row units, and so they can't touch anything. And then when they finally attack with their stride, and they'll think they'll remove it, you'll actually G-guard. And in Aqua Force, we have 2 very good cards that can stop our anomaly from being removed. And so that's Ioannis, which is why she is pretty much the best G-guard we have. But she does cost a counterblast, and that's why running a copy of Dismal is definitely not a bad idea instead of the second Ioannis. But it's only in this specific situation that you actually go into the Dismal if you don't have the CB for it. And so you Dismal, you target your Honolly, and so now it cannot be target, cannot be... it has resist, and it cannot be hit for the rest of this turn. And so that protects your Honolly, and they actually just wasted their whole setup, their whole stride turn, and next turn you just retire their board, and that just kind of generally puts you in a very good situation, in a very good spot. And so I kind of wanted to mention that because that's kind of why I really like the Honolly play. Right. So that's it for the combo video, for the deck profile, and for the extra engines segment. I hope you really liked the video. It was a lot of work to go over all of this, but it's one of my favorite clans in the game, and I felt like if it wasn't such a long video, it would not do it justice. So I will definitely keep experimenting with ways to make this deck work, to finally be able to put it somewhere on the tier list below bad, as some people have put it on Twitter, sadly. Because I think Aqua Force is in a really good spot, but it just does not have anything that makes it broken. It's just a bunch of good cards that work well if everything goes well, and if something goes wrong, you're just trying to hang on for dear life, hoping to find a win con. So it's a really cool deck to play. It's a lot of fun. The art is perfect, and I have a lot of fun with it, so I hope you have a lot of fun with it too. See you in the next one.